Lyndon Johnson hated poverty, and he had a reason to hate poverty.
And maybe that's why I related to Lyndon Johnson.
The Great Society is a remarkable period.
And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
This is American Compassion, an exploration of the past, present, and future of the American safety net and the people behind its construction. I'm Rebecca McEnroy.
And I'm Michael Zapruder. In Season 1 of American Compassion, we went back to the turn of the last century to explore poverty and wealth, philanthropy and charity, work, health, and politics and policy, at a time when the idea of a safety net was just a dream.
And we dove deep into what and who it took to make those dreams a reality.
From workplace safety to fair labor standards.
And child labor laws to the New Deal.
And with all that, we merely scratched the surface of the complex history of the American safety net.
In Season 2, we continue our exploration of the safety net from the New Deal to the Great Society. Stay with us.
When we left off last season, FDR's New Deal and the end of World War II meant America was out of the Great Depression.
In 1945, the average American was better off than he and she had ever been in American history.
H.W. Brands is a historian and biographer whose work covers not only the people behind the American safety net, like Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but in some ways, his work also traces the history of the American consciousness and follows the stories behind the story of America today.
The programs of the New Deal were still in place. They had been confirmed and somewhat expanded during the war. But the biggest change was that the economy was once again strong. In fact, the American economy was stronger in 1945 than it had ever been before. There were a few ups and downs in the half-decade after the war. But on the whole, it was a good time to be a member of the American middle class. It was a good time to be having children. This was the era when the baby boomers were born. And there was a general feeling that we need the government to protect us from foreign harm, from communism and the Soviet Union. But we're not really that eager for any big new government programs in terms of the social safety net. There is one big exception, though, and that is the question of civil rights.
In 1960, people were waking from dreams of earth angels and Chantilly lace to times that were changing.
The civil rights movement, the women's movement, and anti-war protests were drawing attention and building momentum.
Longer nightly news broadcasts meant Americans were seeing more and gaining consciousness of what life was like not only overseas, but right in their own backyards.
People were seeing what it meant to be black in America and to be poor in America. Popular culture, especially music, reflected this in folk music and protest songs like Odetta's "Oh Freedom," in Bob Dylan's "Oxford Town," Nina Simone's "Mississippi Goddam," and in jazz like John Coltrane's "Alabama." These recordings brought the injustices of American life into the public consciousness in a new way.
So on November 22nd, 1963, when the 35th President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, and Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson assumed the role of President of the United States, he wasted no time in getting to work on continuing the legacy not only of Kennedy, but of FDR, and creating a series of programs that he hoped would define his legacy as well.
To go through all of them would probably end up taking like 10, 11, 12 podcasts. There's so many. I'm Julian Zelizer. I'm a professor of history and public affairs. I write about American political history in the 20th and 21st century, covering everything from presidents to social movements to Congress, even to the media. And I wanted to write about Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, in part because there's this window in the 1960s where you have all this legislation passed. You just look at a list of it, and it's kind of remarkable. And Johnson is always discussed in trying to explain why this happened as almost a magician, or because of his deep experience, he just knew how to do what presidents since have not known how to do. And while his skill is important, I thought there must be more to it. It didn't totally make sense. Presidents are ultimately limited in check no matter how good you are. So I wanted to really take a deep dive into that period to see what happened and to understand why it shuts down on him in the last 2 years, which doesn't totally make sense if you take it as being only a result of his skill. And that brought me to Congress and social movements. And finally, the Great Society is a remarkable period of legislating and remaking the relationship between the government and American society. So many of the programs that came out of that period remain intact, even through a very conservative era in American politics. And they had fundamental effects on the way we live, the rights we have, and the kinds of benefits that we can count on.
In May of 1964, 6 months before he would be elected President of the United States in a landslide victory, President Johnson laid out his vision for the Great Society in a speech at the University of Michigan.
I have come today from the turmoil of your capital to the tranquility of your campus to speak about the future of your country. The purpose of protecting the life of our nation and preserving the liberty of our citizens is to pursue the happiness of our people. Our success in that pursuit is the test of our success as a nation. For a century, we labored to settle and to subdue a continent. For half a century, we called upon unbounded invention and untiring industry to create an order of plenty for all of our people. The challenge of the next half century is whether we have the wisdom to use that wealth to enrich and elevate our national life and to advance the quality of our American civilization. Your imagination and your initiative and your indignation will determine whether we build a society where progress is the servant of our needs, or a society where old values and new visions are buried under unbridled growth. For in your time, we have the opportunity to move not only toward the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the great society. The great society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we're totally committed in our time.
And this was no pie-in-the-sky hyperbole. Johnson was the architect of the continuation of the safety net through the Great Society, and that meant
it's breathtaking. Johnson gets as much through as possible in his first year, knowing that his political capital will fade quickly. And sure enough, it does. I'm Mark Updegrove. I'm a presidential historian and the president and CEO of the LBJ Foundation. LBJ knows the ephemeral nature of political capital. As he says after he's elected to the presidency in his own right in 1964, when a president is first elected, he's a giraffe. 6 months later, he's a worm. So while he was standing tall, he wanted to get as much legislation through as possible. So I'm sitting in a room at the LBJ library here looking at a shadow box containing the pens that LBJ used to sign landmark bills into law in just 1 year of his presidency in 1965, when he is standing tall like a giraffe, and he knows he has an opportunity to push through the bulk of the laws of the Great Society. So in the shadow box that I'm looking at, you have the pens that signed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the Higher Education Act, which is a profusion of federal aid to education for the first time in our history and fundamentally changes the educational landscape. You have the pen that signed the Immigration Act. It fundamentally changes the heart, soul, and face of America. You have the pen that signed the Highway Beautification Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. You have the pens that create Head Start, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and Medicare and Medicaid. And you have the pen that signed the Voting Rights Act. This is 1 year of the Lyndon Johnson presidency. That's astounding.
Even after the first year, when his power fades, the breadth and depth of Johnson's accomplishments are profound.
You know, you get safety belts, you get the Freedom of Information Act, you get the Fair Housing Act, you get the creation of NPR and PBS, and on and on and on. This truly is the foundation for modern America, and that's exactly what LBJ set out to do: create something that would give Americans with the least freedom in this country, the least opportunity, a greater chance to realize the fruits of America.
But why? Who was Lyndon Baines Johnson? What was his motivation for wanting to reform the safety net? For wanting to continue and complete the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt? When we return,
It's so painful. Lyndon Johnson concealed the story of his boyhood.
Several things come together after John F. Kennedy is assassinated.
I got to get this funeral behind me, and I got all these heads of states coming.
you're listening to American Compassion. I'm Michael Zapruder.
And I'm Rebecca McEnroy. Stay with us.
The people who are doing the work every day, they're tough. They got thick skins. They got big hearts.
We have to take care of each other.
You're listening to American Compassion because you're interested in how the American safety net came to be. So check out the stories of those who are a vital part of that safety net today.
I just wish that people would see unhoused folks as their brothers and sisters.
When we lean into people as deserving and loving members of our community, that's how we solve this thing.
Findhelp Films is a documentary storytelling project that shines a spotlight on some of the incredible people and organizations working to improve lives, build community, and make sure every American has the safety net they need to thrive.
I still believe America can be that shining city upon the hill for everyone.
Watch the films and subscribe to the YouTube channel at findhelpfilms.com. Welcome back to American Compassion, an exploration of the past, present, and future of the American safety net. I'm Rebecca McEnroy.
And I'm Michael Zapruder. As we mentioned, when Lyndon Johnson assumes the office of the presidency in the wake of John Kennedy's assassination, he doesn't waste any time. The day after JFK's funeral, Johnson and Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to discuss how to honor Kennedy's legacy by passing the Civil Rights Bill.
I won't tell you how grateful I am and how worthy I'm going to try to be of all your hopes.
Well, thank you very much. I'm so happy to hear that, and I knew that you had just that great spirit, and you know you have our support and backing.
Well,
because we know what a difficult period this is.
It's just an impossible period. We got a budget coming up that's we got nothing to do with. It's practically already made, and we got a civil rights bill that hadn't even passed the House, and it's November, and Hubert Humphrey told me yesterday everybody wanted to go home. We got a tax bill that they haven't touched, and we just got to not let up on any of them and keep going, and I guess they'll say that I'm repudiated, but I'm going to ask the Congress Wednesday to just stay there till they pass them all. They won't do it, but we'll just keep them there next year till they do, and we just won't give up an inch.
Well, this is mighty fine. I think it's so imperative. I think one of the great tributes that we can pay in memory of President Kennedy is to try to enact some of the great progressive policies that he sought to initiate.
Well, I'm going to support them all, and you can count on that, and I'm going to do my best to get other men to do likewise, and I'll have to have y'all's help. I never needed more than I do now.
Well, you know you have it, and just feel free to call on us for anything.
Thank you so much, Martin.
All right.
Call me when you...
To the family.
I sure will. Call me when you're down here next time.
I certainly will.
Let's get together, and any suggestions you got, bring them in.
Fine. I certainly will do that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thus began one of the most significant alliances in American history. But who was LBJ? What motivated his keen focus on domestic policy, poverty, civil rights, healthcare, education, especially at a time when the Cold War was heating up and the war in Vietnam was on everyone's hearts, minds, and TVs?
My name's Robert Caro. I'm interested in political power and how it works and what it does for people, both for good and for ill. You see a lot of that illustrated in the life of Lyndon Johnson.
We are all the beneficiaries of Robert Caro's interests and curiosity. In his multi-volume biography of Lyndon Baines Johnson, we have a compelling and complete portrait of a man whose work defined the second half of the 20th century and whose legacy touches American lives every day, even now. He's currently writing the final volume, and he sat down with us to provide his insights for the podcast.
You know, the families in Johnson City were so poor that when the kids were 8, 9, and 10 years old, they had to pick cotton for the harvest. That's the hardest job in the world, they used to say. Back-breaking labor. You drag this heavy bag of cotton behind you through the cotton fields, picking up the poles all day. So Lyndon Johnson always worked beside his favorite cousin, Ava. So Ava would say to me, you know, when they were working together, Lyndon Johnson at the age of 9 and 10 would say to her, "There's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way." It's very interesting. When he was president, they would often visit together. So I asked Ava, well, what would you talk about? She said, well, one thing we always talked about was the cotton. We hated the cotton so much. We never forgot it. So when we talk about Lyndon Johnson and the war on poverty, this is a man who spent his boyhood knowing for himself the effects of poverty, humiliation. His father was the legislator from their area in the Texas House of Representatives, very respected man, had a Johnson ranch. Lyndon Johnson idolized him, campaigned with him, said the happiest days of his boyhood was when he was campaigning with his father from farm to farm. When Lyndon Johnson is 13, his father makes a really bad mistake, buys the wrong piece of land, goes broke, and becomes, in an instant, an object of humiliation in this little town. It's an isolated little town. The father is now the laughing stock of the town. Lyndon has to stand there. He's not running for the House of Representatives anymore. Lyndon has to stand there and listen to someone ridicule his father at a barbecue. He says, Sam Johnson's a mighty smart man, but he's got no sense. And Lyndon knows when he's walking down the streets of the town and his boyhood friends are sitting with their fathers on the porches, the fathers would say to him, never amount to anything, too much like Sam. So Lyndon Johnson hated poverty, and he had a reason to hate poverty. And when someone's suggesting to him that the war on poverty is too bold a statement, he has nothing. He knows what poverty is. Poverty is the enemy, and he knows what he wants to do with the enemy, which is destroy it.
On January 8, 1964, President Lyndon Baines Johnson declares
unconditional war on poverty in America. And I urge this Congress and all Americans to join with me in that effort. It will not be a short or easy struggle. No single weapon or strategy will suffice. But we shall not rest until that war is won. The richest nation on earth can afford to win it. We cannot afford to lose it. $1,000 invested in salvaging an unemployable youth today can return $40,000 or more in his lifetime. Poverty is a national problem requiring improved national organization and support. But this attack, to be effective, must also be organized at the state and the local level and must be supported and directed by state and local efforts. For the war against poverty will not be won here in Washington. It must be won in the field, in every private home, in every public office, from the courthouse to the White House.
President Lyndon Johnson introducing his War on Poverty, January 8, 1964. If we heard that speech today, we would be on Google researching every aspect of who this new president was, where he was from, what was his childhood like, what was motivating his words and his perspectives. But this was 1964. No internet and just a few news stations on TV. Even later, when Robert Caro went to write LBJ's biography, he realized there was such little information about who he was that he couldn't do it without speaking directly to the people who knew Johnson when he was a child. So Caro moved his family to the hill country of Texas to discover LBJ.
It's so painful. Lyndon Johnson concealed the story of his boyhood, basically, till I moved out there and started talking to these people. When he was a junior and a senior in high school, he had a crush on a girl named Kitty Clyde Ross. But her parents didn't want her going around with him. They said too much like Sam. Never amount. He's a Johnson. Their phrase was, he's a Johnson, never amount to anything. So they wouldn't let her go out with him, and they encouraged her to have another boyfriend. And they would put Kitty Clyde and the boyfriend in the back of their car and drive around the town in the evening, including to the courthouse square where Lyndon would be standing, actually with Ava. And Ava said, I saw how Lyndon felt when Kitty Clyde would drive by. She said, I cried for him. So his boyhood was humiliation piled on humiliation. He knew what poverty did to not just being hungry, but being constantly hurt. You know, we were still 12 and 13. The father had gone broke. They'd go into the drugstore where they had the jars of penny candies after school. The other kids would pick out penny candies because they would go on their father's bills, right? But Lyndon's father hadn't paid his bills, so he couldn't get any of the candy. Poverty hurt him in so many ways you don't think of right away. It's not just being hungry or not having new clothes. It's humiliation.
And maybe that's why I related to Lyndon Johnson.
Aaron Gray is the founder and CEO of Findhelp, a software company that helps organizations connect their communities to local social care resources. His work to modernize the American safety net via the findhelp.org network and his focus on supporting people in need have been largely shaped by both his childhood living paycheck to paycheck and by the life and legacy of Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Caro talks about his childhood in such detail, and that humiliation and that fear and the poverty and how he wanted to do something different. And I relate to it. and always have, because I think Johnson wanted to solve poverty in America. I think that was his driver because he actually lived it. I didn't understand what wealth was until I went off to college, and pretty much until I moved to Austin. I remember being in a house with central AC, heat and AC. And I was amazed that one little thermostat controlled the whole house. And my roommate at the time looks at me and he goes, "You've never heard of central cooling and AC?" And I said, "I guess not." I didn't know what to say. I just really believe in the American dream, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
And this idea that every child should have an equal opportunity is what we'll see throughout the story of LBJ and the American safety net. But seeing this opportunity as something that the government should be responsible for providing for its citizens is linked directly back to Franklin Roosevelt.
He knew Franklin Roosevelt as few people knew Roosevelt, because Roosevelt Roosevelt had a policy of never intervening in congressional races or Senate races. Roosevelt doesn't have a lot of patience for politicians. But Lyndon Johnson, who basically started talking to him about the dam and the electricity, Roosevelt starts to invite him, as he invites no other congressman. Sometimes he'd have breakfast with Roosevelt. Roosevelt would be still sitting up in his bed with his Navy cape around his shoulders, and this young congressman would be there. And Roosevelt would just say he'd like to see him. Johnson would come in what they called the back door of the White House, so no one would see him. And I asked one of Roosevelt's assistants, Jim Rowe, why was this? And Rowe said to me, when Roosevelt started to talk about politics, most people didn't really understand what he was talking about. But Johnson understood it all, and Roosevelt saw this. You have to remember, these were two political geniuses talking to each other. And Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson, the two great architects of the safety net.
Completing FDR's New Deal was a major motivator for Johnson's Great Society legislation. But another, more obvious legacy hung over LBJ's presidency, and he didn't take it for granted.
Although Kennedy had shunned Johnson's advice about how to pass civil rights legislation, as president, Johnson used Kennedy's death to get that legislation through as soon as he took office.
Again, Mark Updegrove.
When John F. Kennedy had died, he had proposed the Civil Rights Act of 1963, which would become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Kennedy didn't put much weight behind it, but he had proposed it in June of that year, and when he died in November of the same year, that legislation was languishing. So when Lyndon Johnson took the presidency as an accidental president upon the assassination of Kennedy, he realized he had an opportunity, using the martyrdom of Kennedy, to get the Civil Rights Act through. And Johnson realizes he can make his mark on this nation by passing the Civil Rights Act. And his advisors tell him not to do so, to wait until he earns the presidency in his own right, and then he can push the Civil Rights Act into law. And Johnson hears them out and disregards their advice entirely and looks at them and says, what the hell's the presidency for? He knows he has that moment to push through the Civil Rights Act, and he doesn't hesitate. He does it. And he defeats the longest filibuster in American history in order to make it happen, and runs over some of the very people who helped him to ascend the political ranks, these very powerful Southern Democrats, in order to get the legislation through. It is a true act of political courage.
Courage, yes. And the time was ripe for change.
Several things come together after John F. Kennedy is assassinated that open this window between really 1964 and 1966, when the midterms happen, and close that window.
Julian Zelizer.
One is Kennedy's death, and I think that was important. I don't think that was the only reason all of this happened, but There was more room in the country to follow through on some of the ideas that Kennedy was pushing at the time he was assassinated. So health care, for example. Kennedy, although he was tepid with civil rights, he was all in with Medicare. And he was pushing hard, and it faced incredible opposition. The AMA called it socialized medicine. Southern Democrats in Congress really didn't want this to pass. And Kennedy was pretty frustrated, but after he is gone, Johnson is very conscientious of saying he is going to continue with Kennedy's agenda and using the sympathetic attitude as political leverage. Two, even though this also is not the only reason, Johnson is very good as president, and he does bring to the table immense skills that many others have not had, in part because he was so experienced. He spent his whole life on Capitol Hill. He had been the Senate Majority Leader during the 1950s. So he does have a good feel, in part for the way processes work in Washington and how to maneuver them and manipulate them to achieve power. He also has a really good sense of people on the Hill. He knows them. These are friends and these are adversaries, but people he's been in the room with. So he understands where to push, kind of where to offer carrots and where to offer sticks, and I do think Johnson's skills are important. Third, and maybe this is the most important of all in a broad sense, was the civil rights movement. We don't have many periods in American history where you have a political movement that is putting such unyielding pressure on politicians, presidents, and Congress to do something, to break the status quo. I think the essence of the civil rights movement in its pursuit of racial justice was just saying wait, just being patient was no longer acceptable. On race-related issues, such as voting rights, such as desegregation, or even the war on poverty, the pressure they were putting and the attention they were getting in the media for these kinds of questions was really quite remarkable, and it affected everyone from Johnson and how he thought of these issues and the inevitability of doing something, to legislators who no longer were saying, well, we can just put this aside. And so I think the movement, which really reached many parts of the country by 64 and 65, is quite important. And it had allies, such as the union movement, which was very strong in this period, working with civil rights leaders and creating kind of a mass membership base and ongoing pressure.
Yet even with the significance of this moment and so many things coming together, we asked Robert Caro.
Do you think that there would have been a civil rights bill without Johnson?
No. No. In fact, we know there might very well not have been a civil rights bill without Johnson. When he becomes president, Kennedy has introduced the civil rights bill. You know, you have to understand, Congress at that time, there was what they called the Southern Democrat Republican coalition. That was all the Midwest conservative Republicans and the very conservative Southern Democrats. They controlled Congress. When he became president, it was something like, of the 15 great standing committees of the Senate, I think Southerners or their allies were chairman of 11 of them. Nothing was going through that Senate and the House also. That's another long story. Johnson tries to get Kennedy to understand there's a strategy that can work to get a civil rights bill through. But Kennedy isn't listening to him. You know, Kennedy's humiliated Johnson. He had to beg to get 15 minutes alone with the president to explain him about, in this case, the civil rights bill. What he tries to explain is, don't introduce civil rights until every other bill that you want passed has been disposed of. Because the Southerners' strategy, which has worked for 30 years, is you simply hold up the other legislation. If the president sends up civil rights first, they put civil rights on the floor and then they filibuster. All the other bills which a president needs can't get to the floor. There's only one way they're going to get to the floor: when the president withdraws the civil rights bill, right? So he basically says, whatever you do, don't put up the civil rights bill until your other bills are passed. Kennedy does it anyway. So when Kennedy is assassinated, the Civil Rights Bill is being debated, and nothing else is going through. And the most important bill for Kennedy is his tax reduction bill. He knows he must have a tax cut to expand the economy and get the money for all the other programs that he wants. So Harry Byrd of Virginia, who's been chairman of the Senate Finance Committee for about 800 years, is simply holding hearings forever on the tax cut bill. So nothing is moving.
Passing the Civil Rights Bill was crucial for Johnson, not only because he was continuing Kennedy's legacy, but because it was a foundational piece of his great society and the American safety net.
Where is the safety net for black people when Lyndon Johnson becomes president? They have no political power. They're at the bottom in poverty. They're in the bottom of education. They're in the bottom of everything. Lyndon Johnson understands this. You know, people are always asking me, well, he was such a calculating politician. How do you know he really believed in civil rights? Well, I always felt I knew that because Lyndon Johnson he was so poor. When he's in college, between his sophomore and his junior year, he has to drop out of college for a year to earn enough money to go on. And what he does during that year is he teaches down in what they used to call the Mexican school in this little dusty town down near the border of Texas called Chantilly. So he's teaching, basically they're the kids of migrant workers. And as I wrote, no teacher had ever cared if these kids learned or not. This teacher cared. One of the kids said, having him come to teach us, that was like a blessing out of a clear sky from heaven. So now he's president, and Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill is stalled, and he's going to give this speech to try and propel it, and his speechwriter, a man named Richard Goodwin, basically has a polite way, well, actually it's not all that polite. He asks Johnson, basically, do you really mean this? And Johnson says, listen, when I tore it down in Chantilly, I swore that if I ever had the power, I'd help these kids one day. Now I have the power, and I mean to use it. You know, those speeches are from the heart. His great speech when he says, we shall overcome, people don't remember the circumstances of that speech anymore, where this was the summer of Selma, and we were all watching on television Martin Luther King trying to lead the marches in support of voting, and against them were state troopers on horses with bullwhips, which they were using, and clubs, which they were using, and they were singing, we shall overcome. Of course, that was their anthem. And Johnson gives this speech. I mean, it's one of the greatest speeches in American history. And he says it's not just them,
but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
And he gets the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Bill passed. Like Martin Luther King says, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Lyndon Johnson was trying to bend it faster, and in a lot of ways he did.
Coming up on the next episode of American Compassion.
Well, we learn a couple of things. Johnson is a political animal.
He believed education was the magic bullet.
Right now, of course, we're in there plugging on that poverty message. I think that it needs a little more of a central theme and central core.
American Compassion, an exploration of the past, present, and future of the American safety net, is produced in Austin, Texas and Houston, Texas, with support from Findhelp.
Michael Zapruder arranged, composed, and played the guitar for the music of this show, with Jeff Olson on drums, Mike St. Clair on bass, and Sam Littman on keys.
Special thanks to our guests for this episode: H.W. Brands, Julian Zelizer, Aaron Gray, Mark Updegrove, and Robert Caro. To the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, the American Presidency Project at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the LBJ Presidential Library and Museum in Austin, Texas, for their consultation and use of archived materials. Rebecca McEnroy is our executive producer, and for American Compassion, I'm Michael Zapruder. Thanks for listening.